From the book God No! Nixon, the Aristocrat. I'm the right age for Nixon. He was my bogeyman. When I was a rebellious child questioning authority, the President of the United States turned out to be, without question, a lying sack of shit. I argued with my dad about Nixon, as my hair flopped in my face and my eye makeup ran with passion. I insisted that President Nixon had authorized people to break into a psychiatrist's office and then used illegal means to cover up his illegal act. My moral righteousness was pure. There was no doubt showing in my voice or eyes as I accused Richard Nixon of crimes. My dad's automatic defense of any president of the United States of America didn't have a chance against my youth and fire. How did a Greenfield, Massachusetts, failing public school student know for sure what illegal activities the leader of the free world was guilty of? I didn't. Like a toddler, I was just testing boundaries. Could I go off half-cocked about the President of the United States of America and get away with it? Could I listen to Neil Young and Country Joe in my bedroom, watch the Smothers Brothers on TV and read Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and the East Village Other, and spout that paranoid shit back at my dad and be correct? The way that father-son story is supposed to go? No, I was supposed to be wrong. I was supposed to look back, years later with my dad, and giggle about how wrong I was. I was supposed to say, you know, I really believed all that shit I was spouting. And Dad would say, yeah, and you were passionate about it too. You almost had me convinced. That's the way it's supposed to go. I didn't know jack shit. Turned out, I was right about Nixon, but only by random chance. The showboating, angry young man is not supposed to be right about much. When I say something crazy and hateful, I always want to be proved wrong. My dad couldn't see doubt in my eyes. That's my superpower under this yellow sun. But doubt was in my heart and my mind. I knew I was an ignorant young asshole, and I was waiting to be shown that the president was really A-okay. I'm still that way. When I sit on Fox, CNN, or MSNBC and spout my nonsense, I'm always waiting to be proven wrong. And I very often am. That's the way it should be. When I carry on about our liberties being eroded and the government taking away more and more of our freedoms, I want people to roll their eyes. I want to go into the next decade with egg on my face and more freedom in my pants. In the 80s, Penn and Teller did the Letterman show a lot. I'm still very proud of a lot of those spots. We were good because Letterman and his staff were so great. One of the people we worked with after the brilliant Morty was Frank Gannon. Before coming to work with Letterman, Gannon had worked in the Nixon White House and, along with Diane Sawyer, had helped Nixon write R.N., the Memoirs of Richard Nixon. He went from Nixon to Letterman. I talked a lot to Frank about Nixon. He even suggested that Nixon would meet me for lunch. But that lunch never happened. Nixon chose to die first. Frank talked about Nixon listening to rap music, which he really did. Nixon loved the way rappers used words. Nixon loved words. I listened to the "You Won't Have Nixon to Kick Around" press conference, and now it sounds to me like Bob Dylan's angry, surreal press conference in Don't Look Back. Frank said Nixon was our smartest president, and I believe him. Frank didn't change my mind about Nixon, but he opened it. He brought in more information. Nixon was no longer just a psychotic bogeyman. He was starting to become a complicated genius. I was starting to get that wonderful feeling of being proved wrong. Nixon, the broken genius, listening to rap music as he died, disgraced and proud, started to be a person to me. Nixon said, I'm not a crook. And when his book came out, people protested with the slogan, "Don't buy books by crooks." Frank had changed me. It was years after it came out, but I bought and read the massive book by the crook, and it blew my mind. I learned so much from that book on Nixon. It changed me. Yep, Nixon did all those bad things. But the angry young asshole in Greenfield, Massachusetts was wrong. Nixon was a monster, but not just a monster. In the Crook book, Nixon points out a bunch of factual and ethical mistakes that Woodward and Bernstein made in bringing down Nixon's presidency. Tricky Dick contends that the Washington Post boys made the same mistake Nixon himself made. They thought the end justified the means. They thought that getting Nixon out of the presidency was important enough that they had to bend some rules. The end does not justify the means. Nixon learned that too late. Since reading the book by the crook, I've thought about this point a lot. The ends never justify the means. We're all living only in the means. And we don't ever get to see the real end. We don't get any big accounting of projects at the end of our lives. We just get our lives, day by day, minute by minute, and we have to be good. There's no punchline. There are no ends. There are only means. The supposed end that did not justify Woodward and Bernstein's supposed means was the President of the United States of America resigning on TV. I watched it live, brokenhearted. Other hippies cheered, but I so wanted to be wrong. I so wanted Nixon to be vindicated. Fuck! I want OJ to be innocent. I want my hatred of Nixon to be a phase that I was going through. I didn't want it to be an awful event the world was going through. I wanted my dad to be right. Years ago, someone showed me a videotape of the outtakes from the Nixon TV resignation speech. I saw it that one time years ago, and it stayed in my head. It was another piece of the puzzle in my long-term relationship with Nixon. I just watched those outtakes again on YouTube. And I watched them again and again. The bootleg starts several minutes before Nixon goes live on the air to resign from office. It's his last time addressing the American people as their president. The crew is finishing up with the set, the lighting, and the sound. The recording starts as Nixon walks in with his speech in hand, the speech he will use to resign as president of the United States of America. It's a heavy speech. It's a heavy room. A tech person gets out of the way so Nixon can sit down for the final tech tweaks before they go out live. Nixon looks as the tech guy walks away and says with a big smile, "Hey, you're better looking than I am. Why don't you stay here?" Nixon gives a little laugh and continues, "Blondes, they say, photograph better than brunettes. Is that true or not? You are blonde, aren't you? Redhead?" Nixon is telling the young sound guy that America would rather see an attractive young man resigning than crazy old Nixon. Nixon then tells the still photographer to stop shooting. "I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose," he says with a laugh. Everyone in the room knows that's the least of Nixon's worries. His worry is that the whole world will not end before he makes this speech. Nixon is making jokes. I think about jokes a lot, especially jokes that cross the lines. I worked on a movie, The Aristocrats, where we explored how far you can go with comedy. There was no violence depicted in that movie. There was no nudity in that movie, but there was shocking, unspeakable obscenity. It was the greatest comedians of our time showing that they could be funny, making jokes about rape, AIDS, racism, pederasty, and 9/11. The comedians are amazing. Creative machines with nerves of steel. We made a movie about my heroes. My friend Emery was one of the editors on The Aristocrats. I sent Emery the Nixon outtakes link, and Emery flipped out. Emery knew Nixon was crazy, but man, how could he be this crazy? How crazy was Nixon at this point? Nixon, at this point, was bug nutty. Crazier than Charlie Manson's shithouse rat. But I don't think the jokes are any evidence of that insanity. The jokes and smile are proof that even with all that crazy and evil living in him, Nixon was still a strong, brave, smart human being, more fit to be president of the United States than I will ever be. The ability to make jokes is self-control. The Massachusetts boy that I was would have seen Nixon's smile as pure psycho evil. The Las Vegas man that I am sees it as superhuman strength. I see it as the best of us. Nixon was not fit to be president of the United States of America. He had done bad things. He had violated trusts. And he had gone batshit. But no one is fit to be president of the United States of America if he or she isn't able to make jokes in that room right before resigning. If you're going to make decisions that are life and death to hundreds of thousands of people and life-changing to billions of people, you had better be able to joke with more crushing pressure on you than anyone else has ever felt. I was able to make little jokes at my mom's deathbed. I was able to do that, but I did it through choking sobs. I couldn't have made jokes in that Nixon TV resignation room. I would have been vomiting. I might have died rather than give that speech. I don't mean suicide. I mean my heart might have just exploded in my chest. I might have shit out my liver. I could not have made jokes. That may not be in the top 10,000 reasons I'll never be president, but it certainly is a sufficient reason for me not to be president. I was right as a child. Nixon was a crook. He was the president. He was not above the law. He was not an aristocrat. He was an elected official who worked for us. But as an adult, I know that Nixon, as a comedian, was an aristocrat. Copyright August 2011. Now that was kind of nice, yeah? That's someone who didn't spend his entire life obsessing over Nixon, reflecting on the legacy of Nixon after Nixon's passing. That was someone who grew up in the world that Nixon had shaped, but wanted to see the best in maybe everybody. I think Penn Jillette has a history of that later in his life. I think it's possible because he and Christopher Hitchens were such good friends, and because at the end of Hitchens' life, he was very spurned on by trying to live up to the edict that you should be able to take any side in a debate and express it cogently and with some level of expertise if you were put in that position. I speculate that his frustration with, other members of his peer group and younger people coming up in his business of journalism or public speaking or intellectuals in general or whatever, because he had publicly lamented the lack of ability there in pure debate, not being emotionally attached to the outcome of one side or the other, but actually being able to argue for either side at any given time. I personally would speculate that inspired him to write some of his more confrontational material in magazines before he died, specifically the Women Aren't Funny pieces that he did. Maybe. I think that was a good challenge for him, and it hurt a lot of people's feelings, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way who used to like him and respect him. And, especially in conjunction with his endorsement of George Bush's invasion of Iraq. Lots of people really started hating him for that. But Hitchens had been to Iraq enough times to have a deep, and I think well-earned hatred of Saddam Hussein, and was just fine if George Bush was going to be the guy to, try to depose him. Thoughts for maybe another time, but to me, it serves as good context for what I'm about to recite next, what I'm about to narrate next from Mr. Hitchens, because You probably didn't come here for the nice stuff about Nixon, did ya? The rest of this is going to be the mean stuff. The detailed, aggressive, picking apart the bones stuff as only Christopher Hitchens and Hunter S. Thompson were capable of doing. But to tie what I just said into Penn Jillette, I almost feel like he might have been inspired after Hitchens, his good friend, Christopher Hitchens, passed away, to take that edict about debate and about, argument and flip it the other direction. And I think he was inspired. And obviously, 2011 is before Hitchens died. In terms of his actual passing away in December of 2011, Penn would have had to have written his book, God No, from which that essay was taken. To have it published in 2011, obviously a lot sooner. But I'd like to personally believe that Hitchens' belief in argument and debate, even though Penn Jillette dislikes argument and debate for the most part, he says, I'd like to just personally decide that I believe that he was inspired by Hitchens to be more positive about things that he had openly hated and try to find the good in them. But let's stop trying to find the good in Richard Nixon and move on to Hitch and HST. I just wanted to provide context to justify my choice of Penn Jillette's niceness, which is going to be so out of place with what we get into next. From Slate Magazine, June 29, 2009. Caught on tape, what the Nixon tapes tell us about the Republican Party, by Christopher Hitchens. I wonder sometimes whether the Nixon tapes really will just continue to be the gift that never stops giving. I was in college when Richard Milhous Nixon was first elected president, and I can still remember the profound sense of loathing and disgust that I experienced at the mere sight, let alone the sound of him and of his most especially repellent sidekick, Henry Kissinger. Wiser and older people tell you that the passions of your youth will dry up and that a more sere and autumnal condition will overtake you as maturity advances. But the thought of the Nixon gang in the White House still infuses me with a pure and undiluted hatred that makes me consider throwing up things that I don't even remember having eaten. Just take a look at the most recent harvest from the tapes that the Nixon Presidential Library has released from the early months of 1973. The impressive thing is that even in the smallest details, the obsessive nastiness and criminality of the bigger picture is further delineated. The foulness of Nixon's mind was not compartmentalized between one issue and another. For example, like most family values Republicans, he was distressed by the Supreme Court's finding in Roe v. Wade. But, like almost anybody, he could imagine an exception where abortion might be excusable or even desirable. There are times when an abortion is necessary. I know that. When you have a black and a white, or a rape. The association of ideas between the first mental picture and the second one is so clear as to be, if it were not so hideous, pathetically laughable in an individual, and really quite alarming in a president of the United States. As so often, his remarks about black Americans are crude and often sexual, while his innuendos about his Jewish fellow citizens are more sinister. And as ever, the worst interludes of anti-Semitism occur when Nixon is chatting to his friend Billy Graham. This time, February 1973, the two cronies are discussing Jewish opposition to the evangelical Campus Crusade movement. What the Jews don't seem to get, observes Nixon, is that they bring dislike on themselves. Why, just look at the record. Disliked in Spain, disliked even in Germany. It could be America next. What I really think is deep down in this country, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. And all this is going to do is stir it up. To this apercu, incidentally suggesting that anti-Semitism in this country is not located all that deep down, since it's being vented in the Oval Office. He adds, it may be they have a death wish. You know, that's been the problem with our Jewish friends for centuries. In debates with religious people, I keep being told that even if not all of religion's supernatural claims can be defended as literally true, at least it can be said that religion encourages morality and makes people behave better. In every Nixon tape that has so far been released, he is at his lowest and ugliest and most inhuman when being incited and encouraged, and sometimes outbid by the most famous Christian ever to be born on American soil. I merely pass on the observation. Bad and revealing as all this petty filth and bigotry undoubtedly is, it has a tendency to pale when set against the sheer, brutal cynicism of the conversations about Vietnam. Nixon liked to talk tough in two distinct but related ways about this subject to Charles Colson, another pious Christian among his consigliere. He is heard on the tapes boasting that his massive bombing of North Vietnamese civilians would be vindicated, and that those who opposed it would be held treasonable. His famous confidential secretary, Rosemary Woods, is on the tapes expressing the same hope for an arraignment of disloyal senators and congressmen. But when talking to his most depraved of all associates, Henry Kissinger, he is full of cruelty and bluster when expressing his intention of applying pain to the South Vietnamese. If the South Vietnamese client president, Nguyen Van Thieu, would not agree to sign Nixon's version of what was later to be called peace with honor, Nixon yelled on tape in 1973 that he would cut off his head if necessary. Thus, a huge number of American lives and an incalculable number of Vietnamese ones were thrown away to end the war on more shameful terms than had ever been on offer in the fall of 1968, when Nixon had been in league with Kissinger and Nguyen to sabotage and oppose those very terms. For more on this, see my book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. It was perhaps fortunate from a Republican point of view that the latest batch of Nixon White House tapes was released in a week where more pleasurable and entertaining Republican scandals were diverting us all. At least nobody ever accused Nixon or Kissinger of having any sort of sex life while in office. The distinctly dank reek of the absence of same can be detected throughout the taped records. The continuing problem for those consensus builders who think that the fortunes of the GOP can only be revived by an appeal to the center and the middle ground is that the most scandalous and villainous Republican president of modern times and his realist foreign policy co-conspirator built their appeal in precisely this way. Fate and the declassification process have decreed that we will be supplied with ever more nauseating reminders of this at intervals of about a year until everybody who can remember the one-time hero of moderate republicanism and the silent majority of middle America has gone to a place where not even Billy Graham can bother them anymore. If you enjoy that kind of writing from Mr. Christopher Hitchens, I wholeheartedly recommend looking for an often overlooked book called Love, Poverty, and War. And now onward to the files of Rolling Stone magazine from their collected works of Hunter S. Thompson. He was a crook. June 16, 1994. Memo from the National Affairs Desk. Date, May 1st, 1994. From Dr. Hunter S. Thompson. Subject, the death of Richard Nixon. Notes on the passing of an American monster. He was a liar and a quitter, and he should have been buried at sea. But he was, after all, the president. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Revelation 18:2. Richard Nixon is gone now, and I am poorer for it. He was the real thing, a political monster straight out of Grendel, and a very dangerous enemy. He could shake your hand and stab you in the back at the same time. He lied to his friends and betrayed the trust of his family. Not even Gerald Ford, the unhappy ex-president who pardoned Nixon and kept him out of prison, was immune to the evil fallout. Ford, who believes strongly in heaven and hell, has told more than one of his celebrity golf partners that, I know I will go to hell because I pardoned Richard Nixon. I have had my own bloody relationship with Nixon for many years, but I am not worried about it landing me in hell with him. I have already been there with that bastard, and I am a better person for it. Nixon had the unique ability to make his enemies seem honorable, and we developed a keen sense of fraternity. Some of my best friends have hated Nixon all their lives. My mother hates Nixon. My son hates Nixon. I hate Nixon, and this hatred has brought us together. Nixon laughed when I told him this. Don't worry, he said. I, too, am a family man, and we feel the same way about you. It was Richard Nixon who got me into politics, and now that he's gone, I feel lonely. He was a giant in his way. As long as Nixon was politically alive, and he was, all the way to the end, we could always be sure of finding the enemy on the low road. There was no need to look anywhere else for the evil bastard. He had the fighting instincts of a badger trapped by hounds. The badger will roll over on its back and emit a smell of death, which confuses the dogs and lures them in for traditional ripping and tearing action. But it is usually the badger who does the ripping and the tearing. It is a beast that fights best on its back, rolling under the throat of the enemy and seizing it by the head with all four claws. That was Nixon's style, and if you forgot, he would kill you as a lesson to the others. Badgers don't fight fair, Bubba. That's why God made dachshunds. Nixon was a Navy man, and he should have been buried at sea. Many of his friends were seagoing people. Bebe Rebozo, Robert Vesco, William F. Buckley Jr., and some of them wanted a full naval burial. These come in at least two styles, however, and Nixon's immediate family strongly opposed both of them. In the traditionalist style, the dead president's body would be wrapped and sewn loosely in canvas sailcloth and dumped off the stern of a frigate at least 100 miles off the coast and at least 1,000 miles south of San Diego, so the corpse could never wash up on American soil in any recognizable form. The family opted for cremation until they were advised of the potentially onerous implications of a strictly private, unwitnessed burning of the body of the man who was, after all, the President of the United States. Awkward questions might be raised, dark allusions to Hitler and Rasputin. People would be filing lawsuits to get their hands on the dental charts. Long court battles would be inevitable. Some with liberal cranks bitching about corpus delicti and habeas corpus, and others with giant insurance companies trying not to pay off on his death benefits. Either way, an orgy of greed and duplicity was sure to follow any public hint that Nixon might have somehow faked his own death or been cryogenically transferred to fascist Chinese interests on the Central Asian mainland. It would also play into the hands of those millions of self-stigmatized patriots like me who believe these things already. If the right people had been in charge of Nixon's funeral, his casket would have been launched into one of those open sewage canals that empty into the ocean just south of Los Angeles. He was a swine of a man and a jabbering dupe of a president. Nixon was so crooked that he needed servants to help him screw his pants on every morning. Even his funeral was illegal. He was queer in the deepest way. His body should have been burned in a trash bin. These are harsh words for a man only recently canonized by President Clinton and my old friend George McGovern, but I have written worse things about Nixon many times, and the record will show that I kicked him repeatedly, long before he went down. I beat him like a mad dog with mange every time I got a chance, and I am proud of it. He was scum. Let there be no mistake in the history books about that. Richard Nixon was an evil man, evil in a way that only those who believe in the physical reality of the devil can understand it. He was utterly without ethics or morals or any bedrock sense of decency. Nobody trusted him except maybe the Stalinist Chinese. And honest historians will remember him mainly as a rat who kept scrambling to get back on the ship. It is fitting that Richard Nixon's final gesture to the American people was a clearly illegal series of 21 105mm howitzer blasts that shattered the peace of a residential neighborhood and permanently disturbed many children. Neighbors also complained about another unsanctioned burial in the yard at the old Nixon place, which was brazenly illegal. "It makes the whole neighborhood like a graveyard," said one, "and it fucks up my children's sense of values." Many were incensed about the howitzers, but they knew there was nothing they could do about it. Not with the current president sitting about 50 yards away and laughing at the roar of the cannons. It was Nixon's last war, and he won. The funeral was a dreary affair, finally staged for TV and shrewdly dominated by ambitious politicians and revisionist historians. The Reverend Billy Graham, still agile and eloquent at the age of 136, was billed as the main speaker, but he was quickly upstaged by two 1996 GOP presidential candidates, Senator Bob Dole of Kansas and Governor Pete Wilson of California, who formally hosted the event and saw his poll numbers crippled when he got blown off the stage by Dole, who somehow seized the number 3 slot on the roster and uttered such a shameless, self-serving eulogy that even he burst into tears at the end of it. Dole's stock went up like a rocket and cast him as the early GOP frontrunner for 96. Wilson, speaking next, sounded like an Engelbert Humperdinck impersonator and probably won't even be reelected as governor of California in November. The historians were strongly represented by the number 2 speaker, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, and himself a zealous revisionist with many axes to grind. He set the tone for the day with a maudlin and spectacularly self-serving portrait of Nixon as even more saintly than his mother, and as a president of many godlike accomplishments, most of them put together in secret by Kissinger, who came to California as part of a huge publicity tour for his new book on diplomacy, genius, Stalin, H.P. Lovecraft, and other great minds of our time, including himself and Richard Nixon. Kissinger was only one of the many historians who suddenly came to see Nixon as more than the sum of his many squalid parts. He seemed to be saying that history will not have to absolve Nixon because he has already done it himself in a massive act of will and crazed arrogance that already ranks him supreme along with other Nietzschean Superman like Hitler, Jesus, Bismarck, and the Emperor Hirohito. These revisionists have catapulted Nixon to the status of an American Caesar, claiming that when the definitive history of the 20th century is written, no other president will come close to Nixon in stature. He will dwarf FDR and Truman, according to one scholar from Duke University. It was all gibberish, of course. Nixon was no more a saint than he was a great president. He was more like Sammy Glick than Winston Churchill, He was a cheap crook and a merciless war criminal who bombed more people to death in Laos and Cambodia than the U.S. Army lost in all of World War II. And he denied it to the day of his death. When students at Kent State University in Ohio protested the bombing, he connived to have them attacked and slain by troops from the National Guard. Some people will say that words like scum and rotten are wrong for objective journalism, which is true, but they miss the point. It was the built-in blind spots of the objective rules and dogma that allowed Nixon to slither into the White House in the first place. He looked so good on paper that you could almost vote for him sight unseen. He seemed so all-American, so much like Horatio Alger, that he was able to slip through the cracks of objective journalism. You had to get subjective to see Nixon clearly, and the shock of recognition was often painful. Nixon's meteoric rise from the unemployment line to the vice presidency in 6 quick years would never have happened if TV had come along 10 years earlier. He got away with his sleazy "My Dog Checkers" speech in 1952 because most voters heard it on the radio or read about it in the headlines of their local Republican newspapers. When Nixon finally had to face the TV cameras for real in the 1960 presidential campaign debates, he got whipped like a red-headed mule. Even diehard Republican voters were shocked by his cruel and incompetent persona. Interestingly, most people who heard those debates on the radio thought Nixon had won. But the mushrooming TV audience saw him as a truthless used car salesman, and they voted accordingly. It was the first time in 14 years that Nixon lost an election. When he arrived in the White House as VP at the age of 40, he was a smart young man on the rise, a hubris-crazed monster from the bowels of the American dream with a heart full of hate and an overweening lust to be president. He had won every office he'd run for and stomped like a Nazi on all his enemies and even some of his friends. Nixon had no friends except George Will and J. Edgar Hoover, and they both deserted him. It was Hoover's shameless death in 1972 that led directly to Nixon's downfall. He felt helpless and alone with Hoover gone. He no longer had access to either the director or the director's ghastly bank of personal files on almost everybody in Washington. Hoover was Nixon's right flank, and when he croaked, Nixon knew how Lee felt when Stonewall Jackson got killed in Chancellorsville. It permanently exposed Lee's flank and led to the disaster at Gettysburg. For Nixon, the loss of Hoover led inevitably to the disaster of Watergate. It meant hiring a new director who turned out to be an unfortunate toady named L. Patrick Gray, who squealed like a pig in hot oil the first time Nixon leaned on him. Gray panicked and fingered White House counsel John Dean, who refused to take the rap and rolled over, instead on Nixon, who was trapped like a rat by Dean's relentless, vengeful testimony and went all to pieces right in front of our eyes on TV. That is Watergate in a nut for people with seriously diminished attention spans. The real story is a lot longer and reads like a textbook on human treachery. They were all scum, but only Nixon walked free and lived to clear his name. Or at least, that's what Bill Clinton says. And he is, after all, the President of the United States. Nixon liked to remind people of that. He believed it. And that was why he went down. He was not only a crook, but a fool. 2 years after he quit, he told a TV journalist that if the president does it, it can't be illegal. Shit. Not even Spiro Agnew was that dumb. He was a flat-out, knee-crawling thug with the morals of a weasel on speed. But he was Nixon's vice president for 5 years. And he only resigned when he was caught red-handed taking cash bribes across his desk in the White House. Unlike Nixon, Agnew didn't argue. He quit his job and fled in the night to Baltimore, where he appeared the next morning in U.S. District Court, which allowed him to stay out of prison for bribery and extortion in exchange for a guilty, no contest plea on income tax evasion. After that, he became a major celebrity and played golf and tried to get a Coors distributorship. He never spoke to Nixon again and was an unwelcome guest at the funeral. They called him rude, but he went anyway. It was one of those biological imperatives, like salmon swimming up waterfalls to spawn before they die. He knew he was scum, but it didn't bother him. Agnew was the Joey Buttafuoco of the Nixon administration, and Hoover was its Caligula. They were brutal, brain-damaged degenerates, worse than any hitman out of The Godfather, yet they were the men Richard Nixon trusted most. Together they defined his presidency. It would be easy to forget and forgive Henry Kissinger of his crimes, just as he forgave Nixon. Yes, we could do that, but it would be wrong. Kissinger is a slippery little devil, a world-class hustler with a thick German accent, a very keen eye for weak spots at the top of the power structure. Nixon was one of these, and Super K exploited him mercilessly all the way to the end. Kissinger made the Gang of Four complete. Agnew, Hoover, Kissinger, and Nixon. A group photo of these perverts would say all we need to know about the age of Nixon. Nixon's spirit will be with us for the rest of our lives. Whether you're me, or Bill Clinton, or you, or Kurt Cobain, or Bishop Tutu, or Keith Richards, or Amy Fisher, or Boris Yeltsin's daughter, or your fiancé's 16-year-old beer-drunk brother with his braided goatee and his whole life like a thundercloud out in front of him. This is not a generational thing. You don't even have to know who Richard Nixon was to be a victim of his ugly Nazi spirit. He has poisoned our water forever. Nixon will be remembered as a classic case of a smart man shitting in his own nest. But he also shit in our nests. And that was the crime that history will burn on his memory like a brand. By disgracing and degrading the presidency of the United States, by fleeing the White House like a diseased cur, Richard Nixon broke the heart of the American dream. If you enjoyed that work from Mr. Hunter S. Thompson, may I also recommend the collection Generation of Swine, featuring a lot of his political writings from the 1980s. Or also, if you'd like to read his highly confrontational, accusational screeds that he mailed off to various recipients, like the local power company, his book publishing company, friends of his, former friends of his, politicians he was angry at, magazines he was angry at. Definitely check out the Gonzo Letters Volume 2, Fear and Loathing in America. And with that, friends, I say thank you for being here. Please take a look in the description for a link to support with a follow on social media or a t-shirt purchase or a donation to PayPal, as well as subscribing to the History of Rock and Roll in Film and Rock and Roll, my ongoing podcast about my 3 favorite subjects. But now, let me leave you with a poem from 1941 by Robinson Jeffers called Be Angry at the Sun. This was published in Hunter S. Thompson's book, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72. That public men publish falsehoods is nothing new. That America must accept. Like the historical republics, corruption and empire has been known for years. Be angry at the sun for setting, if these things anger you. Watch the wheels slope and turn. They are all bound on the wheel, these people. Those warriors, this republic, Europe, Asia. Observe them gesticulating. Observe them going down. The gang serves lies. The passionate man plays his part. The cold passion for truth hunts in no pack. You are not Catullus, you know, to lampoon these crude sketches of Caesar. You are far from Dante's feet but even farther from his dirty political hatreds. Let boys want pleasure, and men struggle for power, and women perhaps for fame, and the servile to serve a leader, and the dupes to be duped. Yours is not theirs.